Good afternoon, everyone. Today is Monday, June 12th, 2017, and this is Center for Healthy Sex Daily Meditation Webinar. Today's topic is on surrender. So I want to bring your attention to the fact that Any Meeting has changed their platform a little bit. So we will no longer be able to open the phone lines for live questions, but if you have a question for me, please type it into the chat box. If you don't have that ability or you would prefer, you can email Charlie at centerforhealthysex.com, and he will type it into the chat box for you. So if you have any questions about that, you have to enter it into the chat box now. So let's talk about surrender, which I think is a nice topic as we're entering the summer months. Historically, when I think about June and I think about summer, I do think about surrendering to fun and play and all of the sort of excitement and freedom that the longer summer days bring us. So our quote for today is, "Something amazing happens when we surrender and just love. We melt into another world, a realm of power already within us. The world changes when we change. The world softens when we soften. The world loves us when we choose to love the world." This is a very powerful quote, I think, from Marianne Williamson. And so if we just think about that again, that something amazing happens when we surrender and we just love, when we just open our hearts to love, and to love, which is our essential, our essence, let's say, to begin with. And this idea of melting into another world is also shamanic in nature, where in the shamans say that we really step out of time when we're deeply present. There's no time, there's no place, there's just this now moment. And when we melt into this other world of now, we're in a power that's already inside of us because love is our true nature. And when we change, when we meet the world from a place of surrender, from open-heartedness, from love, then the world reflects that back to us. If we're angry and closed and stressed out, then we're going to be in a world that is angry and closed and stressed out also. So the world softens when we soften, and the world loves us when we choose to love the world. And that is, sort of a more complicated and intricate way of thinking about the glass being half empty or half full. According to what Marianne Williamson is saying, it is however we are. Whatever we present, we give back. To surrender is to relinquish our reserve of personal power in order to realize a higher power. Now, this is kind of a tricky statement because not everybody believes in a higher power. And it's as valid to be devoted to a higher power, a God of your choosing, or to not believe in anything, or to be agnostic and not know what is or what isn't. But when we surrender to something outside of ourselves, then we're in more of a place of free float, more of a place of possibility. As long as I am bound up in this idea that I know everything, or I know what's right, or I know the truth about something, then I'm not really open to possibility. So this notion of a higher power can feel threatening to somebody who was impacted by power games growing up. But it's actually a simple truth when we get right down to it. Our homes, our streets, our schools, society, all spring from a power greater than any one of us alone. Community is a very powerful thing, and that is a power greater than our small selves. So if you can construct it that way, you'll start to see that you're not alone and you don't have to figure everything out yourself. You can indeed ask for help, surrender to something besides your own self. Surrender is negatively viewed by our violent culture. We often think of surrender as being weak, as being cowardly, as compromising of integrity, or abandoning ourselves to the whims of an uncaring adversary. And certainly I found for males in our culture, the notion of surrender, of waving a white flag, means giving up, not having won. And there is sort of a hopeless feeling in that concept of us, of surrender in that way. But when the higher power is recast as a personal threat, a position that it's entrenched in a childhood marked by abuse or neglect, um, this is what we get when we are talking about higher power as authority over us, or someone who's dominating us. Or Paul just wrote, "Thanks for leaving space for those of us sexually harmed by religion." And Marianne Williamson talks about this too, that many of us were poisoned by our religions growing up. So we're not about to surrender to something like that. So we don't want a higher power that is a personal threat. We're looking for something wiser than ourselves, bigger than the sum of our small self, that can hold us in a container, that can allow us to sort of exhale and relax and release into something that's going to hold us and contain us and take care of us. When we talk about surrender in infancy and control in adulthood, the human species is ironically completely surrendered to caregivers for survival in infancy. In fact, we cannot thrive at all without input from an older brain. I mean, this is just an evolutionary truth, that if an infant human doesn't have an adult human encoding its brain through eye contact, through gesture, through touch, through the musical tone of our voice, for facial expression, then we are going to fail to thrive. So we must have these caregivers for survival in infancy. But in adulthood, we're unmatched by any other species for denying powers to others. So we have to have this sort of reliance upon in infancy, but in adulthood, we can deny power to others, we can leave the herd altogether, whereas other species cannot leave the herd even in adulthood, or it brings them grave danger. But that same willfulness tells us we're the ones who have to make life happen, that we'll only be satisfied if we control the situation. And it turns out that's untrue also, because as I've said many times before, humans are gregarious creatures. We need one another for survival. We don't do well in isolation. In fact, people like Dan Siegel tell us that the mind is created in relationship to other minds. We can go out of our minds if we're with people that drive us crazy, if we're people that are raging at us, that are denying our reality, that are emotionally abusive, our minds become disorganized in relation to other people like that. Whereas our minds become calm, our minds become serene, we feel sane and stable when we're around other minds that are calming, that are nurturing, that are caring for us. So it's best for us to not be in isolation and to choose people who are going to take good care of our minds. And this notion of willfulness that tells us that we have to do everything ourselves, that we have to control everything on our own, is as true in sex as it is in other realms of our adult life, that we have to give up control, actually, in order to be sexually available on multiple levels. The fallacy we end up believing is that we will only be sexually satisfied if we control the situation. Now, that's a form of sexual satisfaction. If you're into, being strictly dominant, but even then you have to surrender, and I'll get to that in a moment. But giving up control during sex is crucial to great sex, the same way giving up control in relationships leads to great love. So giving up control, really being able to receive during sex, is absolutely necessary in order to have sexual pleasure. But we don't feel safe giving up control unless we're safe. So let me tell you a little bit about that. There are two different sides of our brains. We know we have a left brain and a right brain, and deep within both of those brains is the emotional center of our brain, let's say. One of them, one side of the brain, the right side of that emotional side of the brain, lets us know whether we feel safe or not. And the left side of that emotional center lets us know whether we're safe or not. So I know the door is locked and therefore I'm safe. And I feel that I'm safe with you. Therefore, my entire system can relax and surrender to the sexual experience. And it turns out that females especially need to not feel stress at all in order to be receptive sexually. And males also need to know that there is safety in their environment before they can actually achieve erection. So we have to hold this paradox all the time in all areas of life, but certainly in the area of sexuality, where we have to feel safe and be able to give up control to that safety and surrender in order to receive pleasure. And lack of trust keeps us stuck in many areas of our lives, and that's why intimacy is a beautiful arena to practice surrender, to practice learning to be betrayed by another person. So learning to trust all over again is sometimes an unfortunate proposition in adulthood, but it is a developmental task that's essential if we're going to want to experience love again, intimacy again, and trust again. Where sex and healthy sex are concerned, it's especially, this notion of surrender especially occurs in sex because we feel another person's breath, we feel their heartbeat, we feel the heat of their bodies. And shared pleasure is a surrendered moment. It's not me making this happen, look what I did, but it's more about this collaborative experience we're having together because we are in this relaxed state internally. So the threat detection system has to be off. There's a state of open-heartedness. We have a felt sense and a known sense of being safe. And sexual intimacy is the result of power with others. It's not the result of power over others. And this is even true in bondage, domination, sadomasochism relationships. These require a consensual surrender to shared power in order to make such exploration possible. So if somebody is strictly being held hostage by somebody, being dominated by them, and it's not consensual, they're going to be in a fear state, and in fact, even a terror state. And that terror state does not allow for surrender. That's going to make the body rigid, tight, ready to fight, to fend off any kind of attacker, or the person's just going to dissociate completely until they're in a state of just a limp bodily-based state. Neither one of those are the states of surrender I'm talking about. Those are danger states. But when you're in a BDSM relationship, there are rules of engagement. And so the person who's submissive is willing to submit to and surrender to the dominant, just like the dominant has to submit and surrender to the submissive on a certain level, because they have to be willing to play by the rules of engagement. So surrender exists in all aspects of sexuality when it's consensual. When it's not consensual, that's a whole different matter. So does anybody have any questions about any of these ideas to this point? I also want to remind you that if you have any questions about sex or sexuality, or issues of intimacy, sexual addiction, sexual compulsivity, then you can call our intake lines and talk to an intake counselor at this time. So someone says, in your BDSM example, is it the agreement that is the higher power? That's actually a nice way of looking at it, I think. That, yes, we could say that the agreement between the two is the higher power. That is the thing that people are surrendering to. And in fact, that's a really beautiful statement, Paul, because I would say in all relationships, the agreements are higher power. Whether you are in a love relationship with someone and you've taken a vow, as in a marital vow, what's happening day to day between the two of you can be arguing and bickering, and what you do and don't like. But ultimately, if you're in your integrity, you're always going to defer to the agreement that you have. And that's true whether it's in a love relationship or with an employer, that you might not like what's happening in your employment situation or with your employee. But if you signed a contract and you signed an agreement, that ultimately you both have to go back and look at that and defer to that. And that is a good litmus test for whether or not you're in your integrity or you're not. When we surrender power, we get to witness true power. It's a very powerful statement, I think, because this kind of surrender makes it possible to experience the power of love. That if I rule by domination, I'm not going to get much in return. If I rule by way of dominion, where I know that this is my space and I get to make the rules and the regulations, but I'm curious about everyone else's experiences or what they need, and I'm taking that feedback into consideration, then we have a much more harmonious ecosystem, whether it's a household, a business, a country. Um, that when we surrender power, we get to witness true power because other people's power and influence and creativity and gifts come into the scene as well. And so we have um, a richer tapestry from which to work with and from which to live and operate from. And so this is a different sort of sweet surrender. Someone asks, what happens when only one half of the relationship surrenders to the other, when it only goes one way? Well, then you're in a power play, I would say, or there's a power differential, or there's power and control being played out. And I think it's very difficult to be in a relationship with someone who's not willing to surrender, to yield, to negotiate. Um, these are sort of oscillation and webs and ebbs and flows in a relationship. If someone is very narcissistic, or they have a narcissistic personality disorder, then it's going to be their way or the highway. And that's very difficult to be in a relationship with because the receiving party is going to feel devalued, diminished, disrespected, not cared for. That person's also going to end up angry a lot of the time and feeling powerless. And so they're going to stop surrendering also because they're going to be in a protective state. So now you've got two people really butting heads with each other. That will not be a sweet surrender. That's, grounds for war, really. And it's not going to go very well. And so if you're in relationship with someone who doesn't surrender, who's not curious or interested in you, who's not willing to negotiate positions and be curious about who you are, and is really listening to know you, and is also talking because they want to be known, then you're probably not in the right relationship for you. What is healthy surrender then? Because I've been talking about surrender where both parties are willing to negotiate, and then there's domination where you likely won't surrender because you feel like you're under siege and you have to protect yourself. But when you let go of your agenda, that's a form of surrender. Whether you're in a business or you're in a relationship with someone, or you're in some sort of negotiation with them, what if I let go of my agenda? Let's see what happens. Because my experience is oftentimes when I am in relationship with somebody I like or I care about or I'm working with, we generally have the same agenda, which is that we want good to happen, whether we're helping people or we want to have success or we want to win a certain we're generally on the same team. But if I have an agenda and you have an agenda and I'm pulling at you with my agenda, if I just surrender my agenda, I might find that your way is just as good as my way. Maybe it's a little better, maybe it's not as good, but we get to the same destination anyway. So when you look beyond your program, you'll find your real potential, whatever your program happens to be or your agenda happens to be. So you can make that experiment today. And try it with the simple things like, driving somewhere with a spouse or a friend, and you're trying to control their driving. Why don't you just surrender and let them take the route they're going to take? And you're probably going to get there in the same amount of time. One route is not necessarily better than the other. And ask yourself if your life has you crying uncle, if you remember what that is from when you were a kid. What do you need to surrender to move into your potential? Is it a behavior or a habit, a personality trait, or a defense mechanism that no longer serves you? So, in other words, are you just so, on the mat that, and you're in so much pain that finally you have to cry uncle or you have to tap out before you'll surrender? That can be sort of a brutal way to go through life. It can make it very difficult for you. Rather than letting go of your agenda earlier, before you're suffering, or before you feel pinned, or before you feel like, you can just no longer take it anymore, that you're sort of, breathing. That's what makes it difficult. So anybody have any questions about this so far? Because I seem to be moving through this material rather quickly today. So to continue with healthy surrender, then, you don't have to know how to surrender. You simply attune yourself to the reality around you, and in that moment, you've already surrendered. You've just let go. And I would advise you to consider taking a walk today when you have a few minutes, even 5 minutes. Go outside, get some air, leave your desk, leave your coworkers, and just take a deep breath and exhale. And just get really present with your surroundings. Look at the trees, notice the air, whether it's humid or really hot, or sort of strangely cool as it is here in Southern California. And let yourself feel exactly what you're feeling in the moment. See what you're seeing in the moment. Breathe in. And notice that in that moment, you've surrendered to the present, to this very now moment. There's no agenda or the earth. There's no judgment about any of it. You're just noticing what is. And in that moment, surrender your need for controlling anything, and just let yourself move through the space and move around the block. And this is more what healthy surrender is. It's letting go to the what is. Now, the paradox in that is that you have to feel safe. As I said before, because someone's saying, can you please elaborate more on healthy surrender? Well, as I said before, healthy surrender requires safety. If I'm going to jump out of a plane, I have to know that my parachute is attached correctly, that I know how to open it, or that I'm with an instructor who knows what they're doing, because when I jump, I'm in complete surrender and my hands are in somebody else's care. Hopefully the expert that I'm tied to who knows what they're doing, because I don't. I've never done it before. That's the kind of surrender that we're talking about. The paradox of preparation, of safety, of knowing who you're surrendering to, or the situation you're surrendering to, or the agreement that you signed, as Paul brought forward, or agreed to. That is the safety net of surrender. And in my example of walking around the block, the safety net is that presumably you're in a safe neighborhood, it's a beautiful day, and you're willing to surrender to the moment as you check out all of the beauty around you. And likewise, you want to surrender your need for control during sex. Let sexual surrender activate your eroticism all the way around your experience, because as I've said before, giving is a position of control. Many of us love to give gifts or give money or give things, but that's really how we control each other. But surrendering is about receiving. So when you really surrender, you can let yourself receive pleasure, beauty, experience. And it's a much more vulnerable, much more vulnerable position also. Um, so the surrendering walk during work is also a mindful walk, asked Stephanie. And yes, it's a mindfulness practice. Whenever you bring yourself right to the absolute presence of what's happening in the moment, that is a mindfulness practice. When you're right here, right now, you're not thinking about anything else, or if you are, you're just noticing it, but you're paying attention to the way your feet hit the ground, the scent around you, the feel of the humidity or the breeze on your face, the way your body feels as it's moving through space and time, the scent of perhaps the flowers around you or the colors of the trees in the sky. That is a mindfulness practice with your eyes wide open. That is a moment of surrender. So it sounds like we're having problems with volume. So that's a note that if you are having problems with volume, that you can call into these numbers and put in the code. So does anybody else have any other questions about this notion of surrender? Whether it's surrendering to relationships, surrendering to the present moment, surrendering to love, surrendering to sex, surrendering to the care of those around you. That surrender is the opposite of the controlling position. And it can be a place of great power. Someone says, the idea of surrender to me is very scary. How can I work to change that? Well, I'd be curious about what about surrender scares you. What I make up about that is that your caregivers weren't very safe, that there was no place for you to surrender and to trust that you were going to be fed and clothed and nurtured and enjoyed and championed in ways. And so when we don't get the fundamental of safety and security as children, it can make it very difficult for us to surrender to others. That's where we feel like we have to control everything because we're not going to be safe otherwise. And I would challenge you to say that that's a fallacy, that if you surrender wholeheartedly and fully, you will be able to find those who are going to catch you around you. But you have to put people in place that are going to tend to your heart, that are going to take good care of you. Paul says, safety during a walk in the park strikes me as much easier safety to appreciate than safety naked in bed with a partner. And that, of course, is true. And that's usually true because of our own judgments. Now, let's assume that you've chosen a partner who is safe, someone who loves you, who tells you that they adore you, who tells you that they love your body or find you sexy or sexually attractive. But you have a sense that they indeed do want you, and that you are safe in their care. If when you get into bed naked, you start to feel difficult with surrendering, that's your own internal self-consciousness or your own judgment. And when you bring that into bed, what you do is you block your partner from wholeheartedly being able to love and adore and appreciate you, because your self-consciousness becomes a block to the intimacy. If your partner didn't want to have sex with you or they found you repulsive, they would probably just say no. They wouldn't have sex with you. So I doubt that most people are going to be lying about that. And you should certainly check that out to make sure it's not the case on the front end. Someone writes, when there has been intimate betrayal of a spouse sexually, how does trust get rebuilt, especially when I, the betrayer, is the sex addict? Well, I would say that, first of all, just asking that question portends well for you, that you are actually taking responsibility for saying, hey, I was the betrayer. I hurt this other person. And so I have to rebuild trust. It's incumbent upon you to take the actions to rebuild trust with people and with your partner, especially. So what are the acts that you engage in every day to help to rebuild that trust? How validating are you of your partner? How much do you let he or she know that you love them, that you desire them, that you find them beautiful, attractive, that you love their body, that you think they're sexy? What acts do you engage in every day to let them know that you are who you say you are and where you say you're going to be? Do you let your partner know about where you are all day, every day, your whereabouts, who you're talking to, what, if you have a program, if you're a sex addict in recovery, what your program looks like? What does your sobriety plan look like? What kind of things are you working on in terms of working the steps? And what are you learning about yourself? How are you making amends every day for the things that you didn't do when you were in your addiction, like being accountable, or taking your partner out to dinner, or knowing the things that your partner likes that makes their life a little bit easier on any given day, or bringing them small surprises during the week, whether it's, the kind of muffin they like for breakfast or a cup of coffee here and there. All of these things move you towards, first of all, making a living amends, because amends are not one-time apologies. They are ongoing processes. So you have to live your amends day in and day out. Your partner has to see your behavior changing before they can start to trust you again. So your word became, unfortunately, invalid when you cheated. And so you have to rebuild trust so that your word actually means something. And your partner can only trust what they see, not what you say. So what is importance in rebuilding trust? So any other questions then about surrender? What's healthy? What isn't? How you rebuild trust so you can surrender? And I would recommend that you try surrendering for yourself, not for the other person. What would be it like for you to just be fully abandoned sexually in bed with your partner, to completely surrender to the pleasure that they want to give to you, and to receive that wholeheartedly and with gusto, and to be ruthless in your pursuit of pleasure? This is a notion that other sexologists have put forward. Jack Morin, Michael Bader talk about a type of selfishness and ruthlessness when it comes to sexual pleasure and surrendering to receiving sex. Not in a way where it's selfish and it's only about you, but selfish in a way where you're willing to be devoured and take in the pleasure that's being given to you by somebody who loves you and wants you. Notice that my image is freezing here during this webinar. So I don't know if you can still hear me or not, but my guess is, I can't tell if you're or not either, but as long as you're still hearing me, we're fine. So I'm going to switch slides. Just, no, it doesn't look like I can do that either. Oh, yeah. Okay, so it looks like I'm back now, or something's happening. I don't know what. So I just want to remind you all that Mirror of Intimacy is on Amazon. So if you want to read this meditation in its entirety, or if you're on our mailing list, and you get our meditations every day. If you don't, you can go to centerforhealthysex.com and you can sign up for the daily meditations, which we send out about 4 times a week now. Or you can purchase the book on Amazon. And I was actually on the book site yesterday just because I check in on occasion to see how it's doing, and see that we have 71 reviews from people, which is fantastic, but only 1 this year. So only 1 review in 6 months, which I thought was a little bit surprising. So I would like to hear more from all of you. If you appreciate these meditations in any way, if you are inclined to write just 1 or 2 sentences about what these meditations have meant to you, we really appreciate it and appreciate your support in the webinars and in the book and in passing the meditations on to your friends and family members. So a reminder, if you have any questions again about sex or sexuality, whether you live in Los Angeles or not, you're welcome to call our intake line at 310-843-9902, and one of our intake counselors will help you with resources and getting to the services that you need in your community. Um, so Paul says, are you asking us to double dip on reviews? No, if you've already written a review, thank you very much. I'm deeply grateful. But if you haven't, please do take the time to write the reviews if you're moved to do so. All right, so I hope that all of you surrender to something today. Take a risk. Go to lunch with a friend. If they say, what do you want to eat? Say, I don't know. Why don't you order for me and see what happens? Take a walk, surrender to the day. Surrender to your partner when you notice that little urge to get into a power struggle with them. Don't do it. And say, you know what, let's just do it your way today and let's see what happens. Not as some sort of sadistic test, but let's really just see what happens and don't sweat the small stuff, as they say. Um, so Paul is saying, please offer a bit of suggestions on small steps to take to test the waters of surrendering and the fear of being known, including sexually known. Well, I don't know. The small steps are some of the things that I just said, where you surrender to the things that don't matter that much. In sex, it may be about taking the risk to tell your partner what you really like sexually and say, you know, I'm going to take a risk here. I've been afraid to tell you this, but I really want you to know this. And so I'm going to tell you that this is the kind of pressure or the touch I like, or the sexual act I like best. And I'm telling you this because I trust you and I love you. And I'm just going to surrender to us trying this, or surrender to you taking the lead in hopes that you will. And I want to be able to provide that for you too. I want to know more about what you want or what you need sexually, so we can both surrender to giving and receiving pleasure to each other. And if you think about that notion that we're here to give and receive pleasure, just like we're here to talk and to listen, to better be known, not to be blamed, not to shame, but to be curious in who we are and who our partners are and how we can better support one another. So see if you can surrender to that today. Someone says, I'm working an SAA program and it is still my character flaws that keep destroying the possibility of trusting me. So if that's the case, then I think you really need to work on what those character defects are in therapy. Because if you keep bumping up against those same defects over and over again, that means that you're stuck and that you haven't really deconstructed what the underlying issue is that has those defenses in place, because those defenses protected you at one time and they're not protecting you now. In fact, they're keeping you stuck and keeping you from getting what you need. And if you can't follow through on what you say you're going to do, and you can't be trusted, then it's going to be very difficult for you to ever be loved, because where there's no trust and no respect, there can be no love. So I suggest that you put your attention on getting some deeper therapy if your program is not leading you into these areas in a way that's more constructive for you. And what if I really don't know what I like, what feels good? Can I be blocking those sensations? Well, if you don't know what you really like sexually or what feels good, then you're probably not experimenting enough with your partner, or maybe with yourself even. So it would be good for you maybe to read some good books on sex and sexuality. There are many books that you can go to. Some of them are on our website under resources, but if you go to Amazon and type in any number of words about sex and sexuality, a million books come up that will guide you in that direction. So you really want to investigate your own sexual pleasure, your own erogenous zones. What do you like? What kind of touch? What's arousing to you in a way that doesn't feel in sort of that dirty, kind of shameful arousing state of addiction, but in a sort of excitatory state that may make you feel a little bit guilty, or maybe a tiny bit of shame, but is that shame born of your judgment of it, or is it shame that's tied to abuse and your addiction? Those are questions to ask yourself. And then to start to try some of these things out with a partner and bring them to a partner and say, these are things I want to try, and let's see what happens. Let's see if it's arousing to both of us. And you might find it to be very sexually arousing, or you might find it to be very hilarious. And so if it's hilarious, you probably won't do it again. But if it's wildly sexually arousing, then you and your partner have learned something about yourselves and about each other. So see if you can get past your shyness, past your shame, past your judgment about your sexual body, and be more adventurous, be more willing to surrender to the moment and to try things out. So you'll see that we just posted a list of where you can find reading materials about sex and sexuality. So get past your own self-consciousness and your shame. Someone says, I find that most of us sex addicts fear intimacy. Is this usual? Well, yes, it's so usual that many people who treat sex and love addiction talk about it as an intimacy disorder. That it's much easier to go have sex with a stranger than it is to have the kind of conversations that I'm proposing, where you're making eye contact with somebody that you love, that you respect, that you feel close to, while talking about what your most erotic sexual secrets are and what you really want to try sexually. And that's what sexual intimacy is about. It's about being known and seen. And, I was thinking the other day about why, if I showed you an anatomical photograph right now of the inside of your ear, of where the cochlea is and all of the little details of the ear canal and how it's connected to the brain, you would see it in strictly an anatomical way. But if I flashed a gigantic picture of a vagina at you right now, that showed you where the vaginal canal was, where the vulva is, where the vestibular bulbs are, where the vaginal opening is, all the way into the uterus, and that picture also had a diagram of the anus and the perineum, you would all get triggered. Everybody would have some sort of arousal reaction looking to that. And I thought about that, and I'm talking anatomical, I'm not talking about pornographic, that why do we get so activated by our genitals and our body parts? And it's largely because of shame, because we don't talk about it, we're not educated about it, we're not taught to enjoy our bodies, we're taught to enjoy them in secret, and that what's pleasurable is dirty and sex is shameful, and all of these messages that get intertwined like this intensely tight ball of yarn that we're terrified to pull apart in the presence of ourselves, for starters, and then with a partner. It makes it so much harder. So my experience is that people cannot have the kind of sex they want to have if they can't talk about sex. So if you can't use sexual words, if you can't talk about masturbation, or anal sex or vaginal sex or oral sex, then you're not going to be able to do these things with somebody. So this process of being seen, and not being afraid that when somebody sees who you are sexually, that they're going to go running away from you because they think there's something wrong with you, is a crucial part to being able to have the kind of sex that you want to have and that you deserve to have. So I hope that answers questions, your question about fear of intimacy for sex addicts. That's absolutely true. And sexual recovery is not just about stopping sexual behaviors at all. It's about getting through the shame of being sexual. It's about the shame of being seen, about the shame of being intimate with someone, so that you can be fully intimate, fully present, have your eyes open, and engage in the kind of sex that you find exciting, delicious, exotic, so that sex is pleasurable and fun for you. Okay, any other questions on this beautiful June 12th day? All right, so take this day again. Remember to surrender to one thing today, or to one person, and notice what that feels like. And I hope you have a beautiful month of June. It's the month of summer, so I hope you've kicked off your summer nicely. And I look forward to talking to you in July. Thank you.